The cold, sterile atmosphere of the bank was interrupted by an unusual commotion. Clint Eastwood, dressed in his signature weathered leather jacket and calm demeanor, was standing at the counter, his piercing eyes locked on the teller. It was supposed to be a normal day, a typical transaction. But then, an elderly man, hunched and frail, entered the bank, shuffling slowly behind the line of customers. He had a worn-out coat on, his face etched with the years of a life that had weathered its fair share of storms. No one seemed to notice him, except for the young teller at the counter who had just finished her transaction with Clint. "Excuse me, sir," the elderly man said politely, approaching the counter. His voice cracked slightly, but there was still an air of dignity in his words. "I'm just here to withdraw some money from my account." The teller barely glanced at him. "You'll have to wait. We're busy," she snapped dismissively, barely making eye contact. The elderly man stood there for a moment, confusion crossing his face, his hands trembling with uncertainty. Clint, who had been quietly observing, suddenly stood up straight. He wasn't going to let this slide. With a sharp step forward, Clint cleared his throat, his voice cutting through the tense atmosphere. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his words deliberate and unyielding. The bank's atmosphere seemed to freeze. Everyone turned their heads toward Clint, and the teller's eyes widened in surprise. It was Clint Eastwood, the icon, the man who had brought justice to the screen in countless films. What could he possibly do in a moment like this? The elderly man, still standing there in confusion, didn't know how to react, but Clint wasn't waiting for answers. His next words, quiet but powerful, left the bank in complete silence. The teller nervously glanced up at Clint, but his eyes remained locked on her. "This man has been waiting in line just like everyone else," Clint said, his voice calm but carrying the weight of 1,000 lifetimes of wisdom. "And you will treat him with respect. Now." His words were simple, but they held such authority that it felt as though the air in the bank had thickened. The room was completely still. The elderly man looked from Clint to the teller, unsure of what to do next. The teller, clearly embarrassed, fumbled with her keys and tried to adjust her behavior. I'm sorry, sir," she muttered, her confidence shattered. But Clint didn't let it go. He wasn't going to allow this moment of injustice to be brushed aside. "Apologies aren't enough," he said, stepping closer to the counter, his gaze never leaving the teller. "You've embarrassed this man, and now you need to do what's right. Help him, and do it with dignity." His voice was steady, yet filled with an undeniable intensity. The elderly man, his eyes now glistening with gratitude, stepped forward and placed his paperwork on the counter. The teller, now visibly shaken, entered the details into the system with a shaky hand. The scene was almost surreal. Clint Eastwood, the living legend, had turned a simple banking transaction into a stand for decency. No one in the bank knew how to respond. Was this real? Was this happening? But as the teller finished, she looked at Clint, her face pale, and nodded in silence. The elderly man was given his money, but Clint's gaze didn't waver. He wasn't done yet. Clint turned to the elderly man with a nod of approval. "There you go, sir. That's the way it should be." The elderly man, who had been trembling just moments before, now looked like a man with some of his dignity restored. Clint had done more than just help him with his transaction. He had helped him regain a sense of self-respect in a world that was often too quick to overlook those who were vulnerable. But Clint wasn't finished yet. He stepped closer to the elderly man and, lowering his voice so only he could hear, he said, "Don't let anyone treat you like you're invisible. You've got as much right to stand tall as anyone else. Remember that." The elderly man blinked, taken aback by the kindness of Clint's words. "Thank you, Mr. Eastwood," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. The whole bank seemed to hold its breath, as if the energy in the room had shifted. Clint had made a statement, but he wasn't done yet. Turning back to the teller, he fixed her with a hard gaze. "And you?" Clint continued, his voice still as calm as ever, but with an underlying sharpness. "I expect better from you. A man's age doesn't determine his value, and neither does his appearance. Respect isn't something you should have to be reminded of. With that, Clint turned and walked toward the exit, leaving behind an atmosphere thick with reflection. People were still processing what had just occurred. It wasn't just about an elderly man being treated poorly. It was about the larger issue of respect, dignity, and the small acts of kindness that could change the course of someone's day or even their life. Clint had done more than stand up for someone. He had delivered a lesson in humanity that no one would soon forget. As Clint exited the bank, the ripple effect of his actions started to take hold. Social media exploded with reactions. Clint Eastwood stands up for elderly man at bank, the headlines read. Clips of the confrontation went viral, shared across platforms, sparking a wave of support for Clint's actions. People everywhere were talking about it. Some praised Clint for using his position to stand up for what was right, while others criticized the teller's actions and called for accountability in the way businesses treat their elderly customers. But the story didn't end there. The elderly man, who had been reduced to a trembling figure moments before, became a symbol of dignity in the face of adversity. Stories started to surface from other elderly individuals who had faced similar treatment in public spaces. The hashtag #RespectElderly began trending, with thousands of people sharing their own experiences and pledging to be more mindful in their interactions with older generations. Clint's act of standing up for one man had sparked a larger conversation, a conversation about how we treat one another, especially those who are often overlooked by society. The bank's management, after being inundated with complaints and praise, issued a public apology, stating that they would be reviewing their customer service practices to ensure that every individual, regardless of age or appearance, was treated with the respect they deserved. The elderly man, who had once been humiliated in front of a room full of strangers, was now a hero in his own right. Thanks to Clint Eastwood, his story had gone viral, and with it came a renewed commitment to treating everyone with kindness and dignity. As for Clint, he went back to his quiet life, but the impact of his small act of standing up for what was right would echo for a long time. His response had gone viral, and it wasn't just the elderly man whose life had changed that day. It was the entire world that had witnessed the power of respect. In the days following Clint Eastwood's heroic act, the world couldn't stop talking about what had transpired inside that bank. News outlets, social media, and even local coffee shops were buzzing with discussions about the viral moment. Everyone had their take. Some hailed Clint as a true icon of decency, while others were simply in awe of how effortlessly he had stood up for an elderly man without a second thought. But for Clint, this wasn't about the spotlight. He wasn't seeking praise or accolades. He was simply doing what he believed was right. In a world where people were quick to brush off acts of kindness as insignificant, Clint's actions stood as a stark reminder that small gestures could spark monumental change. As for the elderly man, he began to see his life in a new light. The kindness Clint had shown him lifted his spirits, and he found himself walking taller than he had in years. He became an unlikely symbol for the movement of respect and dignity that was rapidly gaining momentum. People began approaching him in public places, offering words of support and admiration for his bravery. He never expected to become a figurehead of such a cause, but Clint's words had planted a seed of hope in his heart. The elderly man started speaking at community events, sharing his story of how a simple act of kindness had restored his faith in humanity. What was once a quiet, unassuming man had now found a voice. Meanwhile, the bank's management had been forced to take swift action. After an internal investigation into the incident, the bank released a formal apology to the elderly man and pledged to change its customer service policies. They introduced new training programs for their staff, emphasizing respect, patience, and understanding when dealing with older customers. The move was widely praised, and the bank saw a significant boost in customer loyalty as people began to feel that their concerns were being taken seriously. Clint's one act of standing up for what was right had set a chain reaction into motion, and the effects were far-reaching. Even the teller, who had initially treated the elderly man with Such disregard found herself reevaluating her own behavior. She went back to school, taking courses on emotional intelligence and customer care, determined to ensure that no one else would ever feel the same way the elderly man had in that moment. The incident had been a wake-up call, not only for her, but for so many others who had witnessed it. Clint Eastwood, though, simply continued with his life. He wasn't looking for recognition or awards. He had never been that type of person. But the world had recognized him for who he truly was, a man who, no matter his fame or stature, still believed in standing up for what was right. And in doing so, he reminded everyone that sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones who don't need a cape to do the right thing.